such, the conduct rules apply. And so please be kind to everybody on the call. And also let's please welcome anybody that's new and make sure that we hear all voices so that we can continue to move this idea for V2 network policy forward as a community. So just to give a quick update on where we left off last week, I think we had several ongoing discussions to determine how we were going to move this, the output of this group forward in the quickest and most efficient and thoughtful manner possible. One of the things that we wanted to avoid was continuing to rehash the same concepts and ideas and make sure that we were moving toward an actual set of documents that describe what we're wanting to accomplish, and do this in a way that when we're finished, we'll have something that has been thoroughly digested by this group and thought through and is ready to be taken to the larger network SIG for evaluation. And so we spent quite a bit of time getting volunteers for a smaller draft working group, or a smaller draft group rather, that would begin to put in some structures so that we can take changes in a very GitHub way that allows people to submit PRs and this actually move forward on the Kubernetes enhancement proposals, or the KEPs, by which we want to track the desires coming out of the group, the user stories and such. So with that, we had our first meeting last week. And by the way, last week was very busy. I know a lot of you attended KubeCon and had a lot of different things going on, but we were able to squeeze a little time in as a smaller draft group to put together some of the basic pieces that were going to be necessary to continue to capture ideas within this larger group. So Jay and Abhishek and Ricardo, some of the others that were part of that, Yang I think was part of that as well. I'm going to share with you a repository that was created. We are going to relocate this repository very likely to a more SIG central repository moving forward. We just got quickly started with this. Jay, I'm going to share your repository, kind of what we did to begin with, and then talk about how we're using these different markdown assets to begin to capture these ideas and move them forward. Before I start that, is there any specific news or agenda items that we need to not forget about today so that I can do appropriate time management? Any other topics that the community wanted to make sure that we got to? Okay. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Can I get an affirmation from somebody that you can see my screen?
Yeah.
I assume everybody can see this okay?
Yep, looks good.
All right. So what we did as a group is we went ahead and created a repository under Jay's username in GitHub. We would like to move this again to a more SIG central repository. Jay, I believe your repository is open up for inbound PRs from anybody who wants to contribute. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, anyone can really.
For the time being?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, anyone
great.
can contribute anything, really, to be honest. I mean, or file an issue. And
all right.
If it gets too chaotic, we can deal with that later, but yeah.
So in this repository, there's a couple things that we wanted to capture, and I'm going to let the owners of these different areas talk a little bit more about what they're working on as we get to them. So please be ready to speak up on your different parts. I would prefer I not be the only one to talk today. So this README file is really a representation of the larger umbrella of motivation and desires around network policy v2, and we wanted to capture that in long term. It'll end up turning into a KEP-like structure, but we wanted to give some overall guiding principles for what we're trying to do with this network policy v2. Right now, it's more of an outline than it is an actual set of pros that will develop over time. But we did some brainstorming initially to talk about what the context of this is, what's motivating this work, what deliverables we're looking for, and assigned some temporary owners to those various pieces. And so if you get a chance, I would encourage everyone to, and Jay, could you post this into the chat, please, so that everybody knows where this repository is? I'd encourage everybody to jump into this repository and take a look around. And then some of the other areas that we have here is we also created a separate markdown capturing all the user stories that have surfaced from our previous discussions. I am in the process of taking those user stories and in some cases where those user stories are not fully, are not fully crisp in terms of, what they're trying to represent, I'm going to turn each one of those user stories into a separate KEP document under the stories directory so that we can actually track each individual story separately. And everyone can make, PR submissions to those stories individually. As we work out not only what the user story is, but maybe what are implications in terms of the roles and personas involved in that story, boundary conditions, those types of things that might be relevant for us moving this forward. And I think I just sent in that first PR. I don't know if it got merged yet, but there, for example, we'll have, oh, you'd already merged it. Excellent. So for example, under stories, one of the ones we talked about was name as a policy target, right? And so I'll go in and as a policy creator, I want to do this. So the first step is just making sure we have a very crisp understanding of the story, and then we'll start adding details to each one of these stories as we go along based on the previous work that we've done as a group in capturing all these ideas, as well as figuring out, how these stories relate to each other, what stories are priority, et cetera. And some of that's outlined here in this user stories in terms of, what are non-V1 modifying stories, V1 modifying, cluster scoped user stories, et cetera. Some of that got outlined here. Some of this came out of Dan's work that he did. And so we're going to try to take all the existing work that's been done and incorporate it into these documents. Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit about some of the other assets that are in this directory. So right now, me and Jay and Andrew Ricardo, we're working on the user stories, prioritizing those, making sure that they're cleaned up and very clear about what they're trying to accomplish. Abhishek, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing around the concepts component? Are you online?
Hey, hi, yes. I think me and Jay, we are talking about, once we have the user story set in, what should be the move forward? So on a broad scope, I think there are three kinds of user stories. One is, towards the application developer focused API user stories. The other is towards, an administrator or a cluster scoped API. I think I have not yet captured the third one. And I think this kind of came up with our talk with Christopher this morning. Is some tooling aspect. I think we would also want to incorporate this as part of the agenda or the goals. So to have like some sort of a CLI or a tool well defined, which kind of gives more clarity into the network policies. So the idea would be to get these user stories together and like come up with either a CRD for the cluster scope policy or an update or a new developer-focused resource for the existing network policies, and then some sort of a sketch for the policy cuddle tool. So that would be like the three high-level scope. And I think some of this, and actually a lot of this, also overlaps with the idea or the proposal that Dan Winship had put forward a couple of weeks ago in his document. So that's why I think we would also hope that Dan would be able to contribute to this, because the ideas kind of align.
Great. So in terms of implementation, Ricardo or Chris, do you want to discuss what part 3A and 3B are around KEPs and CRDs?
Yeah, from me, I hadn't started anything yet about the KEP structure. I'm more waiting for the discussions, and then maybe we'll start drafting something. I haven't even reached Chris yet. Sorry, I'm having some hard time here. Chris, do you wanna put something about that here?
Yeah. As for KEPs, we're looking for user stories that make sense as KEPs. So I just created one potentially that just got merged a little bit ago about the CIDR story. And this is one that would be potentially switching the CIDR selector such that it would refer to a slice instead of a string, which it is now. That's something that we could potentially do in V1. It's a very similar change to things that we've done in other areas of SIGNet, like endpoints. And Abhishek mentioned as well the pod IPs. So just going from a singular to a plural. So it's not unheard of, and I think it would make sense as a KEP in itself. The other one that we came across would be defaulting logic. And this one, we opened this issue basically right after we had merged egress and CIDR. And it was the idea of having some alternate way other than the policy types field of specifying basically allow or deny all with respect to egress or ingress. So having some other sort of moniker in there which stands for that. And that is issue, that's actually in the user stories. I linked it in there. There's a specific user story on that one. That one I have a little less idea of how we would actually go about that, what we would do, what was better, but I think it's definitely something that potentially someone could create a KEP for. And those so far are the only two that I found that I think could be translated into an actual enhancement issue with a corresponding KEP afterwards.
Great.
And for 3B, I think that's where so many of them fall, right? Because there's all these cluster network policy things that, we could, in my opinion, we could hack away at them and come up with something that would allow us to experiment with how those things would get potentially implemented in a generic way. Cody mentioned there could be a lot of corner cases there where some of them may not work as well as if you had native CNIs integrating them, but I think that they're cheap and easy enough to play with and implement that it's worth at least exploring what those might look like. There's another way to explore that, which is to literally take what folks in Calico global network policy are doing and folks in the Antra community have for global network policy and look at other APIs and just do a matrix comparison. And I think that is the thing that I'm interested in playing around with. Looking for volunteers who want to hack on that with me in a somewhat undefined, undirected manner. But
Jay, to be a little more to be a little more clear here, what I think you're trying to do with this effort is find an early way to test out APIs without necessarily having a native implementation. So basically translating from a new API to an implementation that utilizes existing enforcement capabilities of existing CSIs, right? Using just like V1. So for example, to do cluster network policy, you would translate that into like multiple namespace policies or something like that, just so that you can kind of test out the concepts around the API. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Taking V1 as a set of primitives as opposed to a set of incomplete semantics, which is the way we're looking at it now, and saying, what can you do with these primitives, right? Because other people in the community have done stuff like that. And it seems like, nobody's really completely fleshed out those ideas, but people have built things around them. OpenShift has, as we know, done stuff, to this effect. And so has, there's some network policy operators out there and stuff like that. And so many of the user stories allude to wanting a solution like that. So.
Sure. So I think that's an interesting approach. I did caution Jay that, that as a final solution may not be very efficient, but it may help us to work through making sure that we get the right API abstractions, at least for accomplishing these user stories. And I think it's very closely related with the next section around templates as well. Is GoBind on?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
All right. So on this section, and I'll let you elaborate more, but my understanding is that we wanted to, as we're thinking about these new user stories, right, we also want to understand how the existing set of primitives are being used to accomplish various stories, so that we can at least see where we're overlapping, or maybe where we already have a way to do something and we just don't know how that works, or help us to understand how to simplify it by having a good library of existing use cases and how we use the underlying V1 primitives to accomplish that. Is that correct, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think that's correct. I just wasn't sure, like, if we were, like, because of open source and how it works, I wasn't sure if, like, we were only talking about the API and improvements to it, or whether templates are also part of this effort. So wasn't sure what the actual sort of quote unquote contribution would look like. You know what I mean?
Well, I thought about this through the weekend a little bit more, and I think that it is actually a useful exercise as we look through the user stories, right? Also think about how we would approach that with V1 primitives, so that we can at least, have a concrete layout of how those various stories would be solutionized with V1, right?
I agree.
And then as we think about V2, we have a more concrete way to actually compare and contrast, simplifying the API or the overall approach, right? So I do think that we need to at least start with what is possible today, more than just the API, but actually applied use cases.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And to that effect, I mean, we already published a few templates for network policy, and they're all open source. They're on GitHub. I can add the link here into this doc as well. But they're trying to attack that exact thing where we have some use cases that we already know of, that we think are common sort of things that people would like to do, and we should just abstract them away and put it into V1 policy.
Do we have permission to duplicate those into this repository, so that if we need to tweak them or enhance them a little further?
Yeah, you can totally fork it. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that might be useful.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, what ends up happening is something that you would almost say in one sentence to when you're talking about it is like, oh yeah, I want default deny, something like that as a baseline sort of set of policies, which is pretty common when you can imagine, like, many customers would like to use Kubernetes for stuff like that. But when you actually get to it and try to implement something like that with our network policy API, it gets very hairy very quickly, and then it becomes a natural deterrent for customers to actually try to use it. So we just sort of like went ahead and said, yeah, this one sentence, here's a gigantic policy, but you don't really care. You can just put it on your cluster and it's done. So so I think it's really worth doing that exercise. I agree.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, so that
Wait,
kind of
if
lays
others
out.
pardon me, sorry.
ahead.
If others want to like help with templates, like please do so. Like just because it's my name there doesn't mean that I'm the only one working on this. I just want to make sure everybody's okay with that.
Yeah, I think that goes without saying for all of these areas, right? Like these were the initial group of volunteers that said, hey, we need to move this forward. We need to get some, we need to get a little paint on the canvas, right? So that we can start critiquing it and involving others. So
Yep.
It's sometimes useful to at least, like for example, with the user stories, to have a couple of them written out, and then others can take some of the other user stories and start following kind of a template, right? To understand what all aspects of that story they need to list out and how to make it easier to consume for the larger community.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely get involved on that. Okay, so we've laid out at least an approach now. We've got an existing repo. So there's still a couple of outstanding items. One is, where should this, like I'm really appreciate Jay creating this repo. I don't know that it needs to necessarily live there. I think it's going to be appropriate to move that into a SIG repo. So I think a couple of outstanding items that we need to accomplish is, what is it going to require to move this effort into a SIG network repo, number one. And number two, we need to open the floor up right now to the community to give some feedback on this approach. What's missing? What do you want to see more of? How do you want to get involved? Any comments on this?
I'm guessing if it got moved somewhere, it'd probably be under the Kubernetes SIGs repo.
Okay.
Yeah, do we
That might
have
make sense.
the process for getting one of those? Like it seems like it's one of those things that you might ask for one and then you'd have to justify it somehow. And that's what I was wondering. Like, I don't want to be the guy that's like, give me a repo, like
Well,
like, what do we do? How do we do that?
Andrew, do you have some experience in this area?
I do, yeah. So for Kubernetes 6 repos, it's actually much easier. You just have to get one of the SIG co-chairs to sign off on it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but if we wanted a Kubernetes repo, that has to go through SIG architecture and everything. But I don't think we need that here.
No, I think this is still developing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jay, did you have something? Oh, I thought Jay had something to say. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying, just open an issue in the org repo, and then, yeah, I guess assign it to one of the chairs.
Excellent. We can definitely do that. So
Right away.
I will.
Do
I
that.
can take it as a action item or and open that up, and then I will basically tag yourself, Andrew, you, Jay, some of the others on that initial draft as associates on that issue.
Yeah, I'll make it.
Okay.
I'll assign that to you.
That's fine. I'll take care of it. All right.
So
Any other?
Not using the GitHub repo?
We are using it. We're just going to eventually migrate it to an official Kubernetes one.
Right. Okay.
That way it that's right. That way it falls under the standard CNCF usage guidelines and all that kind of stuff, right? So we'd like to be part of that official repo since this is an official working group. Okay, so I see some other people on the call that are not part of this initial draft team. Any comments? I don't want to call you all out by name, but I would like your feedback. Is this something that's you find useful? Do you feel that there's enough information that's been given for you to get involved in potentially the editing of the stories or the CRD work or the template creation, so we can understand, how the V2 ideas are different, that type of thing. Does everybody feel that this is at least a good start?
Hey, Cody, this is Aniket. Yeah, I think so. I
Yes.
think this gives us a good streamlined method of approaching this problem and decomposing it further. I think it's a good
Okay.
mix of tactical stuff and some things that are strategic enough that we can make some
Yeah, it's very
reasonable
tactical
progress.
at first. I agree. Yeah, thank you, Aniket, for the feedback. Anything that's missing that we are not addressing that you think that we need to, as that's going to be a required deliverable for the larger SIG network group?
So
One of
Anik,
the questions.
I
Oh, go
would
ahead.
ask you, just curious if you know, we're looking for people to help us maybe own and hack on some of these different things in smaller groups. You think you might be interested in grabbing the reins on any of these and helping out with any of these specific things? And if so, which ones, or anyone else, Jacob or Matt or anyone else, or Shufeng or whoever else is here?
Your opinion and your input matters, right? We're glad that you're listening in, but we also want you to get involved, and let's see if we can push this together as a community. Not trying to be pushy, but I think the whole community benefits when everybody jumps in and does some of the lifting here. So if you decide that that's something that you can contribute, please in the next couple of days go in and submit a PR to the README with your name on one of these areas. And one of the initial draft team members would be more than happy to spend, I'm sure, 30 minutes or an hour with you to sit down and talk about what could be your initial contribution and would be there to help you, through that contribution in any way that they can. So I want this to, again, be, as collaborative as we can. So please let us know how we can help you get involved. All right. So Jay, you talked about some process around triaging and as these PRs come in and kind of how you want to handle this as a team. Did you want to discuss some of your ideas there?
Yeah, I was just hoping, Cody, we could, people could file issues about things they're concerned about, and we could just tackle those as the way that we address things that aren't clear yet. Because what we've been doing, before seemed to have just been a lot of going in circles because there were so many things and there wasn't a targeted goal when we were discussing the user stories. But it's very clear that there are people who really do want to continue improving the user stories. So I was thinking to raise the bar for how we talk about user stories is, so that the conversation has a little more information content. From now on, we file an issue against a user story if we think it's incorrect, and we specify exactly what that user story is, and we triage it just like any other issue in any SIG would, and we'll just work through it.
So I'm going to make one recommendation just to ensure that we have efficient use of this time. Number one is I think that the interaction in the community needs to continue to be async. I think that this, going forward, this hour that we have set aside every week should be used to review what changes were made between this meeting and the last meeting, and for us to, for ones that seem to be more contentious or had more discussion about, right, we bring those to the forefront and share that with the overall community. If there were things that were simple changes that there was, a lot of agreement on, then maybe we push those to the bottom of the priority stack. And then that way this time is used to actually discuss things that we did have contention on or that need more group discussion to ensure that we flesh it out.
Yeah, like we should try to solve these things offline. Absolutely. Like the only reason we triage as a group is because we, for some reason, didn't do our work during the week. Yeah.
Okay.
That makes great. That's perfect for me.
So with that said, is there anything that we want to, we've got 25 minutes. I want to make this a useful time period for everyone. Is there anything that was added? I know we talked about kind of the structure of the repo and some of the initial things that were put in place. Is there anything that we want to review that was initially added that may have enough information yet, or are we still in a draft stage that we want to push some of the initial review to next week?
I don't think we added anything. I did have a bunch of, like, all those issues that you see there now came from a review that I did with general questions.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know people just got a whiff of this. I know Andrew's going to definitely have some things he's going to want us to clarify also. And I just now sent him the link to it 5 minutes ago. So maybe you're right. Maybe it's not really ready for a full triage. Maybe we can triage this async. And
well, I think we've made progress by at least getting this created. We've got some initial teams assigned. We're actually have some active PRs that are happening now. So unless there are other issues within the community to address, I'm going to recommend that we, on Friday of this week, that we put together at least an initial list of agenda items, maybe issues we want to discuss or specific PRs that we want to discuss. Again, that require more discussion, and finalize that list on Monday morning of next week. And then that way we come into this meeting with a clear goal of what needs to be discussed and accomplished during the hour that we have together. If there's not objection to that, I'm going to recommend that we go ahead and close today's meeting unless there's any other additional business that needs to be accomplished.
sounds good to me.
So I have a question. I think
Sure, Abhishek.
one of the things that last week we decided was to go over or not finalize, but at least discuss the overall goals and non-goals of this sub-project. So do you think that it makes sense for us to review some of that, just the goals and non-goals, so that
Surely, we can do that.
we can either limit or at least be aware that, you know, these are the user stories that make sense for us to tackle?
Sure. So let's go over the motivation, and then if there's additional things that we think we're missing on either the motivation, the goals, or the non-goals, let's go ahead and get these itemized. And then once we have a good outline, we can start converting that into a prose for the actual so-called super KEP that we're putting together here. So number one, Kubernetes is becoming the OS of the cloud. And I think really what we're getting at here is as part of the becoming OS of the cloud, having a way to specify network policy in a consistent way, regardless of underlying implementation, becomes important. So we may need to clarify that a little bit more. Number two, users prefer vendor-specific APIs due to the lack of Kubernetes network policy API deficiencies. Any thoughts, agreement, disagreement? Going to sound like Ferris Bueller's Day Off here. Questions, anyone?
So one thing I wanted to actually, I tried fixing this in my local repository, but I had trouble checking it back in somehow. So I'm still working on that, but I think there are two negatives in the sentence. It's not the lack of deficiencies. It's either the lack of or deficiencies. I think it says both. So,
okay.
So
no, but you can just make a pull for that. You can just make a pull request through the web UI. You don't even need.
I did this return and it just like declined. I tried to do a git push or something and it just complained. Anyway, I'll follow up with you.
Yeah, let's Zoom or something after this sometime or tomorrow, and we'll get you to speed.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, but I do agree with the general premise of the sentence, which is like, because we are missing, you know, a few key sort of, you know, ways that people are used to doing, say, firewalling or whatever. They do prefer vendor-specific APIs, and you would hear like, you know, hierarchy and deny rules and things like that that come up quite frequently.
Yeah, we just need to take lack of out of there. I think Yeah, that makes sense. Perfect. Cluster administrators need APIs beyond current developer-focused APIs for securing the cluster, not just apps. Unified network security approach can simplify auditing.
I'm not so sure if this is a motivation for our like project, but like in general, yeah, it's true. But I'm just not sure if there's a clear link between this sentence and like what we're trying to do.
Yeah, Cody, maybe you should like make those like more problem-y, I guess. The motivation is really talking about the problems, right? And then the goals are going to be addressing those problems, and then the non-goals are going to be addressing things that aren't our problems, right?
Possibly. Maybe we should have a related set of things, because I think in the real world, auditing is, however we construct network policy, making it easy for CNI or network policy enforcers in general, right, to provide auditing is a requirement in most uses. So I'll figure out how to break that out. Good feedback. Sorry, I've got children in the background making lots of noise. APIs are confusing for basic use cases like default deny. People want to, go ahead.
Makes sense too. Sorry, I was just saying +1.
People want to secure apps using other abstractions in addition to label selectors. Maybe not just secure apps, but basically author network policies that target other abstractions. I think that can be better worded.
Yeah. So I think this, like, the motivation here is sort of ease of use, I guess, right?
Ease of use is the motivation. That's right.
Yeah. Right.
That's right.
Understood.
So we can move that down.
Like growing the sort of scope and breadth of the functionality of network policy. The last bit is around like ease of use, and the middle, I guess, is more enterprisey stuff. Yes, ish.
Right. I agree.
Okay.
I kind of remember that Calico, they delivered something called Calico Network Policy. It looks like.
So what about the Calico network policies?
Yeah, I didn't get the.
Like from their documentation, it looks like their Calico network policy can provide some other secure options besides the network policy API that we are providing.
Right. What that goes to that second item, users prefer vendor-specific APIs due to Kubernetes network policy API deficiencies. I think that's what we're addressing there, is they are preferring vendor-specific APIs because the upstream API is not complete enough to meet all the use cases.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so like one of our goals would be that people can still use Calico or, Tujera or whatever vendor is involved with that. But at least when they write those network policies, even if their vendor has a excellent implementation, they don't have to go and learn some vendor-specific API language for something that's so fundamental to Kubernetes, like the network policy, right? It's almost like that should be like, well, I was going to say one other thing. It's almost like one of our goals, it might be worth saying one of our goals is that everybody uses network policies for their applications because they're really easy.
Yeah. So that's the end of the motivation. Gobind, can I tag you to make the updates that we just discussed to the motivation side? Because I think you had some really good insight there.
Sure thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can figure out how to get Git push working, but yeah, yes.
Sure. Okay, so for goals, one of the goals we had was we don't want to break anything, and what we meant by that is we want to, clearly follow Kubernetes API rules and patterns, as well as, if we're adding new things and such, we want to make sure that, there's a clear distinction between the new way and the old way of doing something, so that we don't muddle things even further if they're already confusing or break something. Did that make sense, or do we need to add more clarity to that statement? Okay. We want to simplify migration when using new capabilities. So if somebody wants to use something new, we want to make it easy for them to adapt that without having to rewrite a bunch of things, for example.
So does this entail, like, if somebody has Calico network policies, we will help them migrate to the newer API that we come up with, or is that a non-goal? Because it sounds like that's what we are suggesting here.
So what we care about are the actual APIs. It will be up to, if this API gets adopted by SIG Network, it will be up to the network policy enforcement plugins, right, to adopt them. I think migration from one CNI implementation or network policy enforcement implementation to another is out of the scope of this document. What we're talking about specifically is how does one go about creating the upstream resources in a way, right, that allows you to migrate from one API to the other API, or to do things with the new API while you still may have things that are operating in the old API. So I want to clearly separate like the actual runtime upgrade of an enforcement engine or a CNI from the use of the API. And maybe we need to call that out.
I mean, that said, I get what you're saying, Cody, but I mean, given that one of the things we want to do ultimately is help people, if we can, to use policies, and the solutions may not be as simple as changing the APIs. I wouldn't rule that out. I wouldn't rule what he set out as something that somebody may be interested in exploring and contributing. I think it's harder to frame that like you said, right? It's harder to frame that.
Right. Well, some of the migration, for example, I'll give a specific example, right? We may tackle a use case that is currently solvable using a vendor-specific API now. We are not going to be responsible for writing a migration engine that goes from that vendor-specific API to the upstream, to the version 2 of the upstream API, right? That allows it to be solved with a Kubernetes network policy rather than a vendor-specific network policy. That would be up to the vendor to provide that migration capability. Did that help clear that up?
Yeah, it does. I think that just needs to be called out more explicitly, because right now that term migration is fairly overloaded.
Fair. That's fair. Yeah, we need to talk a little bit about what we mean by migration.
It might be generalized further to just vendor-specific tooling. We're not interested in building anything vendor-specific, whether it's a migration utility or whatever, right?
That's true. Develop a new set of APIs for application policies. I didn't write this one. Who submitted this one? That wants to talk about that?
Sorry, did we skip one?
I did. I apologize. Let me go back one. I got distracted. Develop a new administrator API so that RBAC can be used to separate roles if desired. So I think the gist behind this one was, if we're talking about doing more cluster scoped or administrator targeted APIs, we wanted those to be separate resources so that we can take advantage of RBAC in terms of limiting who has access to those
Got it.
capabilities.
So this would be like a brand new sort of, I don't know, I'm going to call it Uber Never policy, like a new API.
Right, right.
Okay.
Note that that could wind up being an OPA hook. We haven't really talked to the OPA people, but the policy people reached out a few weeks ago, and they asked if one of us could come give a talk over there, which I would encourage anybody, if you wanted to do that, go ahead and do it. Maybe I'll do it if not, but there's a policy group, and this might wind up being something that would be done in collaboration with them, or that they may be more appropriate to own, I think.
And Jay, that would be an example of something that would also be appropriate for the templates part of this project, where we call out existing ways that certain things are accomplished. And then we can, weigh the merits of those existing ways versus new ways of doing it.
I just wanted to say one thing that's totally missing here is we don't have a goal here of suggest possible API changes to the network, SIG network group, which is like the obvious elephant in the room of the original reason why we all got together. What? So can we just add that? Or, like, I mean, it seems like that would be one of the goals, right? Originally, that was the goal before we started thinking more deeply about it.
Okay. So now on to the next one, develop a new set of APIs for application policies.
So I think we need to revert the previous, the administrator API, because there seems to be some sort of confusion. I think there are two things that are being overloaded there. One is that we are looking to write a new resource which would satisfy all the administrator user stories. So that would be equivalent to a cluster scope network policy, or like a global network policy. I wouldn't say global, sorry. I would say cluster scope network policy. The second one, the current one that we are talking about, like a develop a new set of APIs, I would reword it as develop a new set / update existing network policy APIs which are meant for the application developers.
Okay. Thanks, Abhishek. Next goal, and I know we've got 8 minutes left, so I'm going to keep moving this forward. Deliver value as quickly as possible. I wrote this one because I wanted to make sure that part of the reasons of breaking the stories into individual KEPs is that we wanted to set our proposals up in such a way that we can show progress. We know that the SIG network is loaded, and especially the technical review that happens there is loaded with a lot of different priorities, where V2 at times may be a lower priority. So we wanted to ensure that we at least can prioritize some of these stories so that we can continue to make progress regardless of the current workload of the reviewers, within the committee. So there's got to be enough separation of concerns and story and all of that we can do that.
Yeah, mainly because some stuff people know they want to do, and they might be engineering driven, and they might not be community driven, but they might be an improvement. And
right, this can't be a massive overhaul effort.
Yeah.
Better documentation was a goal. I don't think anybody can argue against that. Generalize the concept of endpoint, not just pods. What this had to do with, there's a couple of user stories around targeting workloads that are not native Kubernetes workloads, as an example. And these are going to be, where we target things like IP addresses, network sitters, or a named resource that includes both of those things. That way, the network policy is more useful. Okay. comprehensive error reporting so that when we have errors occur, this is somewhat tangential to the better documentation. We want better runtime information from our tooling, from our logging and such. The question is where do we draw the line between native implementation and what the upfront API can offer? So this is more of, do we provide some type of a facility for providing feedback as part of the API?
Yeah, I was going to ask that same question. Like, if we're just defining the API, then what kind of error reporting are we restricted to, and whose responsibility is it to actually report that error across Kubernetes?
Right. So part of the API is, well, we can ask those questions, right? Like if there are other facilities within Kubernetes, right? That like events, for example, that can be recorded against CRDs. And so if we have suggestions on improving the overall usability of network policies, we might be able to capture various pieces of feedback as an event, for example, and make that as a requirement for compliance, to the API, those types of things.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so the non-goals, and then we'll wrap up the meeting. Graphical user interfaces are out of scope in general. Right, we're not talking about building the next UI for network policy. Protecting non-Kubernetes workloads. So right now we don't have in scope, for example, doing host protection or any other type of protection that's beyond a native Kubernetes workload. Intra-pod restrictions. So right now we're drawing the network policy outer boundary at the pod boundary. That means things like process restriction, restrictions on kubectl exec, etc. with access to network is out of scope for this current iteration. Support for encryption of traffic, out of scope. And support network policies spanning multiple clusters. So currently our scope is going to be the cluster, and if there are abstractions that are needed for multi-cluster management, that's out of the scope as well.
So one thing that I saw which is missing in both goals and non-goals is a lot of user stories are geared towards the more visibility into the policies, like whether my policies have been realized correctly, what is the effect of my policies. So the tools like those, I don't see them either in goals or non-goals. So is it a goal or non-goal for this sub-project?
I'm sorry, Abhishek, I missed the very first part of that being a non, which is a non-goal or goal?
The DevOps tools related or the CLI related things. Like for example, I need to know whether my pods are able to communicate with each other because of.
So I think we need to further flush that out. I think what I'm hearing from those that have been participating is it would be useful to have a defined way from a command line perspective or a tool set perspective to query and interact with policies. We might, similar to the way we're developing APIs for network policy, right? We may say that, hey, if you enforce network policies to be compliant with the overall user tooling, you also need to implement a native tool that provides these querying capabilities, using these formats. I still think it's API driven, right? I mean, the CLI itself is an API, just not a Kubernetes CRD type API, right? And maybe we end up even developing a query CRD object, right, that can be fulfilled by native implementation. So I don't think it's completely off the table yet. I just think we need to be very clear on how we delineate that from saying that we're going to build the tool versus defining the API for the native implementations to build the tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that non-goals, I'm not really a big fan of being super like restrictive about the non-goals because I feel like, I feel like we do need to spend some time exploring these concepts, and I feel like some of these non-goals will help us to do the primary work that we need to do. So I almost feel like the non-goals is more of a thing that it's a kept thing because you want to be clear about exactly what you're defining. And some of the things from a formal KEP may not have a perfect impedance match to what we're trying to do here, which is kind of build a community, right? And the community, if enough of us are interested in something or people say they're interested in something, I think that helps, that that could become more or less of a goal. But it's certainly not a primary goal, to your point, Abhishek, right? Like, yeah, like the original reason we formed was not to build a command line tool, right? So I think that's worth specifying too, that not all goals are created equal, right?
Yeah, it's worth calling out because it even though it's a very desirable feature or user story, I feel like that will help us move on to the next steps of actionable items.
And let me give you an example of this too. Just, I literally thought this one up just now, but if we were talking about reachability, right? While it's not necessarily a network API, one of the things we might think about is we know that there's the concept of readiness on a pod. Well, if we know that a particular pod has to be able to contact a particular service, right? We might want to build in as part of that readiness check the capability to access that service, right? And if that ever changes, right, like be able to have feedback. And there's other ways to do that, right? I mean, the pod could actually query that service, and if it can, it could report back readiness status. So we're getting to muddle things. Like, again, this was just off the top of my head, so I don't say that it's a good idea, but there may be some standard way we want to think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, my vote would
but
be to just change it to something like, to that example, right? Something like, like primary goals, and then, topics to explore, right? Or something like that.
So we're at the top of the hour. It's been I think a useful and productive meeting. I think we need to bring it to a close though. So if there's not any other issues that the community wants to address, please, we will link out this repository in our agenda, and please visit this repository, begin making some pull requests. By Friday, we should be putting together an agenda for the next meeting of specific PRs we want to discuss and or user stories, etc. And let's work this week to begin fleshing out the details of these stories and begin to criticizing them. So I appreciate everybody jumping on board today. And at that, unless there's any other issues, I'm going to go ahead and bring this to a close.
Yeah, please do file issues if you have any ideas around anything. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a great day. This ends the meeting.